Marie sat at her small kitchen table, the faint hum of the refrigerator breaking the silence of the room. In her hand was an envelope that had arrived earlier that day, marked with her son Eric's handwriting. She had been waiting for this moment for months, hoping for a formal invitation to his upcoming wedding. Eric had always been her pride and joy, the boy who used to cling to her legs as a child and laugh at her silly jokes. Though their relationship had grown strained in recent years, Marie held on to the hope that this wedding might bridge the emotional gap between them. With cautious excitement, she opened the envelope and pulled out the ornate invitation. The card was beautiful, white with delicate gold trim and elegant calligraphy that read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the union of Eric and Sarah." A smile began to creep across Marie's face until she noticed something peculiar. Nowhere on the invitation was her name. Marie's heart sank. Maybe it was a mistake? Perhaps Eric assumed she'd understand that she was invited without needing her name on the card. She decided to call him to clarify. She dialed his number, her fingers trembling slightly. It had been weeks since they'd last spoken, and even then their conversation had been brief and curt. As the phone rang, she rehearsed what she would say. When Eric finally answered, his voice was flat and distant. "Hi, Mom," he said, his tone more dutiful than warm. "Hi, sweetheart, I got the wedding invitation today," Marie began, trying to keep her voice light and cheerful. "It's beautiful, but I noticed my name wasn't on it. Am I still invited?" There was a long pause on the other end. Marie could hear Eric exhale, the sound heavy with tension. "Mom," he began, "Sarah and I talked about this. We think it's better if you don't come." Marie froze, her breath catching in her throat. "What? Eric, what are you talking about? Why wouldn't I come to my own son's wedding?" Parrot's voice grew defensive. "You know why. You've always made things complicated between me and Dad. We want the day to be about love and family, not old drama. Sarah doesn't feel comfortable with you there." Marie felt a wave of anger and sadness wash over her. "Eric, I'm your mother. Whatever issues you think we have, we can work through them, but to exclude me from your wedding, it's cruel." "Cruel?" Eric's voice sharpened. "Do you know what was cruel? Growing up and watching you ruin our family. You always blamed Dad for everything, but you were just as bad. I've spent years trying to rebuild my life after what you did, and I'm not letting you ruin this for me." Marie's hands gripped the edge of the table as tears welled in her eyes. "Eric, that's not fair. You don't know the whole story. Your father—" "I don't want to hear it, Mom," Eric interrupted. "This isn't about the past. It's about Sarah and me. Please, respect our decision." Before Marie could respond, Eric hung up. She sat in stunned silence, staring at her phone as if willing it to ring again. Her mind raced, replaying the conversation over and over. How could her own son blame her for the divorce? She had done everything she could to shield Eric and his sister Lisa from the truth about their father. She had endured years of neglect, manipulation, and heartbreak to keep the family together as long as possible, and now she was being painted as the villain. That night, Marie couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, her mind clouded with memories of her marriage to Paul. He had been charming and attentive when they first met, but that charm quickly faded after their wedding. Over the years, Paul became distant, prioritizing his career over their relationship. When he wasn't working late, he was out with friends or at business events that conveniently excluded her. Marie suspected he was unfaithful long before she found the incriminating receipts in his jacket pocket. Hotel bookings, expensive gifts, and dinners she hadn't attended. When she confronted Paul, he didn't deny it. Instead, he turned the blame on her, accusing her of being overly emotional and ungrateful. It was a pattern that repeated throughout their marriage, and for years, Marie stayed silent for the sake of the children. She didn't want Eric and Lisa to grow up in a broken home, so she endured Paul's lies and gaslighting until it became unbearable. When she finally filed for divorce, Paul retaliated by poisoning Eric and Lisa against her. He painted himself as the victim, claiming Marie was unreasonable and vindictive. At the time, Eric was a teenager, easily influenced by Paul's version of events. Despite Marie's efforts to maintain a relationship with her children, Paul's narrative took root, and their bond slowly eroded. Now, years later, Marie found herself shut out of one of the most important moments in her son's life. She couldn't let this be the end of their relationship. She decided to reach out to Sarah, hoping that a conversation with her future daughter-in-law might help smooth things over. The next morning, Marie called Sarah, her voice steady despite the knot in her stomach. Sarah answered cheerfully at first, but her tone quickly shifted when Marie brought up the wedding. "Marie, I understand this is difficult for you," Sarah said, her voice laced with condescension. "But Eric and I have made our decision. We just want to avoid any unnecessary tension on our special day." "Tension?" Marie repeated, her voice rising. "I'm Eric's mother. How can my presence be a source of tension?" Sarah sighed. "It's not just about you. It's about the history between you and Paul. Eric doesn't want any drama, and frankly, neither do I. We're starting a new chapter, and we need positive energy around us." Marie felt her frustration boil over. "Sarah, I've spent my entire life supporting Eric, even when he believed lies about me. I deserve to be there. You don't know the full story." "And I don't need to," Sarah replied sharply. "This isn't about the past, it's about what's best for us now. I hope you can understand that." The call ended, leaving Marie feeling more isolated than ever. She realized that no amount of pleading or reasoning would change their minds. Eric and Sarah were determined to shut her out, and Paul's influence was stronger than she had imagined. As the days passed, Marie wrestled with her emotions. Part of her wanted to respect Eric's wishes and stay away. But another part of her couldn't accept being erased from her son's life. She knew she had to find a way to make Eric see the truth. Not to ruin his wedding, but little did she know, the road to reconciliation would force her to confront long-buried truths and challenge the lies that had shaped her family's narrative for years. Marie sat in the quiet solitude of her living room, staring out the window at the rows of neatly trimmed hedges lining the street. Her hands rested on her lap, still clutching the photo of her family. The one that used to hang above the fireplace, now tucked away in a drawer. It was a picture from a summer vacation years ago, before everything changed. Paul was smiling broadly, his arm draped over her shoulders, while Eric and Lisa stood beside them, grinning in matching outfits. Back then, they were a picture-perfect family, happy and whole. At least, that's how it had seemed from the outside. But memories had a way of unraveling, turning nostalgia into sharp, jagged truths. Marie ran her fingers along the edges of the photo, feeling the weight of every detail, the way Paul's eyes seemed too distant, the tension barely hidden beneath the surface. It wasn't long after this picture that Paul had always been ambitious, driven, and successful in his career, but his obsession with his work slowly took over their lives. He would often spend late nights at the office, returning home just long enough to eat before rushing out again. When he was home, his phone constantly buzzed with calls and texts. Clients, colleagues, meetings, always keeping him just out of reach. At first, Marie tried to convince herself that it was just the demands of his job, that it wasn't personal. But the growing distance between them made her uneasy. Then came the first whispers. A woman's name, Rachel, mentioned casually in passing, a seemingly harmless coworker. Paul dismissed Marie's concerns, chalking it up to jealousy. "You always overthink things," he'd say. "It's nothing, just harmless conversations." But deep down, Marie knew better. By the time she had concrete proof, flight itineraries, hotel bookings, and receipts from dinners meant to be business meetings, she could no longer deny what was happening. Paul was having an affair. It was as though a curtain had been pulled back, exposing the cracks she had long ignored. Confronting him was one of the hardest things she'd ever done. It was late one night, after putting the kids to bed. She had gathered the evidence, carefully laid it out on the dining table, and waited for him to come home. When he walked through the door, exhausted from another long day, Marie didn't beat around the bush. "Paul, we need to talk," she said firmly, her voice steady but trembling beneath the surface. He paused, removing his coat, his expression guarded. "What's wrong?" Marie gestured to the table. "I know where you've been. I know who you've been with." Paul's face twisted into a mixture of confusion and defiance. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about Rachel, about the money you've been spending, the lies you've been telling. You can't deny it anymore." For a moment there was silence. Then Paul's lips curled into a smug smirk. "Is that what this is about? Jealousy, Marie? You always think I'm out to get you. You're so paranoid." Marie's heart sank. The familiar pattern, denial, deflection, rose up once again. It was as though Paul had perfected the art of turning everything around on her, twisting the truth to make it seem as though she was the one overreacting. But Marie was done playing that game. "Don't do this, Paul. Don't pretend this isn't happening," she said, her voice firm. "I deserve better than this. We deserve better." He scoffed. "Better? You think you can do better? After everything I've done for you? After everything I've given you?" But Marie's resolve had hardened. "You've given me nothing but lies and neglect. I want a divorce." Paul's eyes narrowed, his tone becoming icy. "A divorce? Fine. But it won't be that simple. You won't get away with this. I'll make sure everyone knows who the real problem is." That had been the beginning of the end. The divorce proceedings were long and brutal. Paul threw every weapon at her, attorneys who painted her as unstable, accusations of infidelity on her part, and subtle manipulation of Eric and Lisa. Through it all, Marie's focus was on keeping the children safe, trying to protect them from the storm swirling around them. Yet, even with all the evidence in her favor, witnesses who had seen Paul's behavior, the messages, and receipts, Paul's influence was undeniable. Eric, still just a teenager at the time, began to distance himself from Marie, caught in his father's web of half-truths. Paul had convinced Eric that Marie was unreasonable, that she was overreacting, and that she was the reason their family was falling apart. Lisa, younger and more impressionable, followed Eric's lead. Paul was clever. He knew how to manipulate, how to sow seeds of doubt. And soon both children saw Marie through the lens that Paul had created, a mother who was angry, emotional, and difficult to deal with. It was during those years of the divorce that Marie's relationship with her children began to deteriorate. She begged Eric to listen, to hear her out, but he refused. "I've heard both sides, Mom. I choose to believe Dad," Eric told her one night after school. "He's my father. You can't change that." The sting of those words pierced deeper than any betrayal ever could. Marie tried everything. Family counseling, letters, heartfelt conversations. But nothing seemed to reach Eric. Slowly but surely, the gap widened between them. Eventually, she learned to brace herself for the sting of rejection, as if it had become a daily ritual, a painful reminder that the child she had nurtured and loved so deeply had chosen to turn away. As Marie relived those memories, sitting alone in the quiet of her living room, she could feel the weight of it all settling over her once again. The lies, the manipulation, the wounds she had carried for years. It was Paul's legacy, and it had seeped into the very heart of her family. The worst part wasn't just that Paul had betrayed her. It was that he had also succeeded in poisoning their children's view of her. Eric no longer saw her as his mother. He saw her as someone who had torn their family apart, a villain. And now he was about to marry, about to begin a new chapter in his life. Marie took a deep breath, trying to steady herself. The shadows of the past loomed large, but she knew she couldn't afford to stay lost in them. If she wanted to repair what had been broken, she needed to find a way to reach Eric, before it was too late. But how could she repair something so fractured? How could she reclaim a family that had turned away from her? The day of the rehearsal dinner had arrived, and Marie felt a knot of unease tightening in her chest. She hadn't been invited, she knew that much, but something deep inside her refused to accept that she would stay home and simply let her son walk into his wedding without her presence. After the calls with Eric and Sarah, after the cold rejections and the doors that had been slammed shut in her face, Marie knew she couldn't stand idly by. She wasn't going to sit at home and be ignored. This wasn't just about attending a rehearsal dinner. It was about reclaiming a place in her own family, a place that had been taken from her. Marie had decided she wouldn't show up like an uninvited guest, but she would attend the event with purpose, to make sure they understood exactly who she was. So, in the early evening, she donned a simple but elegant dress, something neutral, something that would make her blend in without demanding attention. Her makeup was subtle, but her expression was determined. She left her small apartment and drove to the venue, an upscale banquet hall near the city center, where the dinner was being held. As she stepped inside, the sounds of chatter and clinking glasses filled the air. The venue was beautifully decorated, string lights hung from the ceiling, tables adorned with elegant centerpieces of white roses and candles. There were groups of people, family, friends, wedding party members, smiling, laughing, chatting as they mingled. Marie moved through the crowd, keeping a watchful eye out for Eric and Sarah. She knew they were hosting the event, but there was no sign of them just yet. Most of the guests hadn't noticed her. She moved quietly, blending into the background. It was almost like being invisible, but it didn't bother her. Eventually, she caught a glimpse of Sarah. Sarah, who had made it so clear that Marie wasn't welcome. Sarah stood in a small circle of friends and family, laughing and gesturing animatedly as she spoke. Marie watched from afar, carefully observing the woman who would soon become her daughter-in-law. There was something calculating in Sarah's expression, a demeanor that seemed polished, but underneath it all, Marie suspected something darker. Then Marie spotted Paul standing at the bar, drink in hand, his usual confident smirk on his face. He looked as though he owned the room, as if this event was all for him, the same smug self-assurance that had defined him during their marriage. And standing next to Paul, someone else, Eric. Marie's breath hitched as she saw her son. He was wearing a tailored suit, chatting casually with some of the other groomsmen. "I'm here to remind Eric that he has a mother who loves him, who cared for him, even when you made it impossible. I've stayed silent for too long, and it's time he knows the real story." Eric watched the exchange silently, his expression unreadable. There was tension in his shoulders, a conflicted look in his eyes. Marie could see that he was trying to decide what to believe, caught between his mother and his father, two competing narratives, two conflicting loyalties. Paul cleared his throat. "Eric, come on, let's go talk. I don't need this drama at my daughter's rehearsal dinner." Eric hesitated for a long moment, his eyes flicking between his father and his mother. Then, without another word, he turned and followed his father away from the group, leaving Marie standing there, alone, once again. Sarah glared at Marie before turning on her heel and walking away, leaving Marie to fend for herself. Marie stood in place for a moment longer, watching as they walked away. The room seemed to blur around her, the laughter, the chatter, the music, but in that moment, it all faded into the background. Her mind was consumed by the weight of what had just happened, the seeds she had planted, the fragile hope that had been offered, and now, Still, she wasn't ready to give up. She couldn't afford to. She would find another way, another chance to reach Eric, no matter how long it took. Because this was her son, and she wouldn't lose him without a fight. Not this time. The weeks that followed the rehearsal dinner were difficult, more painful than Marie had anticipated. She couldn't stop thinking about Eric, about how distant he had become, how he had chosen to side with his father. The rejection stung, but it also fueled something deeper within her, a need to reclaim what had been taken from her. She couldn't sit idly by while Paul and Sarah erased her from her son's life, and he cost. Determined to find a way to reach Eric, Marie threw herself into searching for answers. She pored over old letters, photos, and memories, every detail, every moment that reminded her of the bond she once had with her son. She remembered the times they had shared, sitting together reading bedtime stories, Eric's first day of school, the countless hours spent at the park. Those memories felt like her anchor, the evidence that she hadn't simply vanished from his life, that she had been a loving and dedicated mother. But it wasn't enough. The wounds were too fresh, and Eric was too deep into his father's influence. Paul's manipulation had succeeded. Eric believed Marie was angry, unstable, and bitter. It seemed as though her efforts to break through were futile. One evening, Marie sat at her small kitchen table, staring at her reflection in the window as the city lights glimmered in the distance. She sighed heavily, her hands trembling slightly. The weight of everything, the betrayal, the loss, the loneliness, it was overwhelming. How had things come to this? How had her family disintegrated so completely? It was then that something unexpected happened. A letter arrived in the mail, a simple, unassuming envelope with no return address. Curious, Marie opened it slowly. Inside was a single sheet of paper, neatly written in handwriting she didn't recognize. "You know the truth, Marie. It's time you speak up." Her heart skipped a beat. The message was cryptic, but something about it felt like a sign, like she was being urged to act. Could it be someone who knew the truth about Paul? Someone who wanted to help her? Someone who wasn't afraid to stand up against the man who had taken everything from her? Marie's mind raced with possibilities. Was it someone who had witnessed Paul's betrayal? A friend or former colleague of his who had finally grown tired of his lies? She couldn't ignore this. She needed to find out more. Over the next few days, she did some digging. She started by searching through her contacts, people she hadn't spoken to in years, old acquaintances, mutual friends of Paul. Gradually, she uncovered something startling. A retired colleague from one of Paul's former business ventures had been following the situation from afar. This person had quietly documented Paul's affairs, his deceit, and his ongoing manipulation of their family. They had kept detailed notes, interactions, conversations, even emails. The connection felt like a lifeline. With this information, Marie knew she could finally expose the truth. She wouldn't just show up at her son's life anymore. She would fight back with facts, evidence, things that couldn't be twisted or ignored. Determined, she arranged to meet with this informant, someone who wanted to remain anonymous but had agreed to share what they knew in exchange for her promise to help reveal the truth. The meeting was set in a quiet, out-of-the-way cafe, far from prying eyes. Marie arrived early, nervously glancing around as she found a secluded corner table. She ordered a cup of tea, her hands trembling slightly as she waited. Eventually, a man, older, with a carefully neutral expression, approached. He sat across from her, lowering his voice. "Marie," he began quietly, "I know what's been happening. I've followed what Paul has done, how he's turned your family against you, how he's spun everything to make you look like the villain. But it's time for the truth to come out. I've gathered everything, emails, receipts, text messages, that prove Paul's deceit. I've kept these for a long time, but now they need to be shown." Marie's eyes widened. Her heart raced. For the first time in months, she felt like she might have a chance to regain control. I don't know what to say," she murmured, feeling tears sting her eyes. "This is everything I've wanted. But why now? Why help me?" The man's expression softened. "Because I've seen what Paul has done, not just to you, but to your family. It's wrong, and I can't stand by and let him get away with it. I want to help you set things right, help you show your son who his real family is." Marie's grip tightened on the teacup, her mind racing. "But this is dangerous. Paul will fight back. He'll twist everything. He's always been good at that." The man nodded gravely. "He'll try to spin it, of course, but you have something he doesn't. Truth, solid, irrefutable evidence. and the truth has a way of speaking louder than his lies. For the first time in a long time, hope surged within Marie. She knew this wasn't just a chance. It was her opportunity to stand up and fight, to push back against the man who had stolen her family from her. She spent the next few days poring over the documents, emails, financial records, hotel bookings, phone logs, proof that couldn't be denied. Everything showed that Paul had been living a double life, one for the business world and another for his own pleasure. The evidence painted a picture of deceit, betrayal, and manipulation. But she still had one final piece of the puzzle. She had to reach Eric, truly reach him, before the wedding. Not just as a mother who had been wronged, but as someone with the truth. She had to show him that the father he thought he knew was someone entirely different, someone who had been lying, cheating, and covering his tracks for years. With the documents securely in hand, Marie made a decision. She would reach out to Eric directly, one last time, before the wedding. She wouldn't force her way into his life. No, she would approach him gently, carefully. She would give him the chance to see what Paul had hidden all these years. The evening before the wedding, Marie drove to the place where Eric was staying. The house his father had helped him set up, a few miles outside the city. She parked her car discreetly down the street and walked quietly to the front door. She wasn't sure how he'd react, whether he'd be angry or cold, but she couldn't turn back now. She rang the doorbell, standing there with her heart pounding. A few moments later, the door creaked open, and Eric stood there, suit-clad, a hint of surprise in his eyes. "Mom?" Eric blinked, visibly taken aback. "What? What are you doing here?" Marie's voice was steady but filled with warmth. "I wanted to see you, Eric. Just for a moment. I need to talk to you. Can we talk inside?" Eric hesitated, his gaze shifting behind him as though considering something. Then, finally, he stepped aside. "Come in." Marie followed him into the house, her eyes scanning the space. Neat, carefully arranged, but lacking the warmth she once remembered. She took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had prepared. Now she had to make him listen. "Eric," she began softly, "I know I wasn't there when you needed me most. I know I've made mistakes. But I'm still your mother, and I'm here now because I have something important to show you, something that will change everything you've believed." Eric frowned, folding his arms. "What do you mean?" "I've already made my decision, Mom. I've moved on. I'm marrying Sarah tomorrow." Marie took another step closer, gently placing the envelope of evidence on the table. "This isn't about the past, Eric. It's about the truth. About who your father really is. I want you to see for yourself. You deserve to know the man behind the mask." Eric's brows furrowed. "I don't understand. What are you talking about?" Marie reached out slowly, unfolding the first document, an email thread between Paul and another woman, with dates, times, and conversations that couldn't be ignored. She handed it to Eric, watching his face carefully. As Eric read, his expression shifted. His eyes widened. His mouth tightened. "What? What is this?" "It's proof, Eric. Proof of what your father has done. Proof of the lies, the betrayal, the things he never told you." Eric's breathing quickened as he scanned the documents. His body seemed to stiffen, his fingers shaking slightly. This can't be real," he murmured, disbelief washing over his face. "It's real. And there's more. I didn't come here to hurt you. I came here because you need to know the truth before it's too late. Before you marry someone who doesn't deserve you." Eric's gaze flicked from the papers to Marie's face. "Is this why you showed up at the rehearsal dinner? To plant these "I showed up because I'm your mother, Eric, and I've been silent for too long. But I'm not here to destroy your life. I'm here because I love you and I want to protect you. I don't want you to make the same mistake I did, believing everything Paul tells you without question." For a long moment, Eric stood in silence, holding the documents in his hands. His mind was racing, wrestling with what he was reading, with the implications. Slowly, his eyes began to fill with uncertainty. Finally, he exhaled slowly, setting the papers down. I need time to think about this. Marie nodded. I understand. Take all the time you need. But know this. Your father isn't the man you think he is. And I'll be here if you need someone to talk to, someone who's telling you the truth. As Eric absorbed the weight of her words, Marie turned to leave, her heart heavy but hopeful. She had planted the seed, and now it was up to him to decide what to believe. For the first time in months, she felt like she might have a chance to reclaim her place in her son's life. Even if it was just the beginning, it was a start, a chance to rewrite the story they had once shared. Because she was his mother, now and always, and she wasn't going to give up without a fight. It was the first time she'd seen him in weeks, and though he appeared happy, there was a stiffness in his posture, a guardedness that she remembered so well. She had to steel herself. She had rehearsed what she would say, what she would do, but now that she saw him up close again, everything felt more overwhelming. She needed to approach carefully, not in a way that would cause a scene, but in a way that might allow him to see her, not just as a memory from his past, but as... With determination, Mary moved through the crowd toward Eric. Her heart pounded in her chest, and yet she remained calm. She wasn't going to let fear dictate her actions. As she drew closer, Eric began to turn slightly, and she found herself frozen. His eyes met hers. At first he didn't recognize her. His brow furrowed as he took in her face. Then, slowly, a flicker of recognition appeared. His jaw tightened. Mom? Eric's voice was low, barely above a whisper. Marie's breath caught in her throat, but she forced a smile. Hi, Eric. It's good to see you. Eric blinked, visibly surprised. What are you doing here? I thought you weren't coming. I wasn't invited, but I couldn't miss this, she said softly, looking at him with genuine warmth. You look so grown up. You look happy. Eric's expression shifted from confusion to something more guarded. Mom, what are you doing? This isn't the time or place for you to show up. You weren't invited. And Sarah doesn't control who I am, Marie interrupted gently. I'm still your mother, Eric. I've been shut out, but I'm not going to sit back and let this happen. I wanted to see you, to tell you. She hesitated, her voice catching. I'm sorry, Eric. I didn't come here to cause trouble. Paul, who had been watching from a distance, finally approached, his eyes narrowing as he sized Marie up. Well, look who decided to show up uninvited. His tone was condescending, but his eyes held a deeper threat. Marie didn't flinch. She met his gaze head-on, her spine straight. I didn't come here to make a scene, Paul. I came for my son. You don't get to decide that I don't have a place in his life. Paul chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. You think you still have a place here? This is a wedding, Marie. This isn't about you or your grudges. He leaned in slightly, his voice lowering. You've made your point before. Eric doesn't need you anymore. He's moved on. And so should you. Marie's fists clenched at her sides, but she refused to let him provoke her. You think you've won, Paul, but I won't let you keep lying to our children. You've poisoned them against me, but I'm still their mother. That's not something you can erase. At that moment, Sarah joined them, looking cool and composed, but with an edge of impatience. Marie, she said, her voice sweet but cold, what on earth are you doing here? You weren't invited. This isn't your place. Marie turned toward Sarah, her expression steady. I'm Eric's mother. That's enough of a reason for me to be here. I wanted to talk to my son. Sarah's eyes narrowed. Talk? About what? Your past? You've had plenty of chances to speak to Eric. He doesn't want you here, and neither do I. This is about starting a new life, and we don't need you dragging old drama into it. Marie's lips pressed into a thin line. I didn't come to cause trouble. I came to remind Eric that I'm still his mother, whether you like it or not, and he deserves to know the truth about what really happened between his father and me. Sarah's face twisted in frustration. The truth? You've had your chance to tell your side of the story. Eric has made his decision. He trusts us. You've lost that fight. Paul smirked. Give it up, Marie. This isn't about love or truth. It's about control. You're desperate to manipulate Eric, just like you always have been. Marie's heart ached at his words, but she forced herself to remain calm. I'm not here to manipulate.